The shift nobody wanted started at 11 at night and ended at 7 in the morning, and Clara Vega took it because the extra $2 an hour was the difference between Marco's school field trip and Marco sitting at his desk while the other kids climbed onto the bus. She had worked in hotels for 15 years. She started at 19 as a housekeeper at the Oak Ridge Inn on the south side of the city, making beds with the efficient care of someone who understood that the quality of your work was the only argument available to you when you had no seniority, no connections, and no one in a position of authority who knew your name. By the end of this story, I'm also going to share something special with those of you who stick around to the end, something that can help you in your personal life. But first, let's get back to. The manager at the Oak Ridge had been a compact, humorless woman named Greta who walked the floors at unpredictable hours and made notes in a small leather journal she kept in her left breast pocket. Clara had learned, in her first month, that the notes Greta made were not primarily about speed or whether the stock carts were organized. They were about accuracy, whether the headboard dust was addressed, whether the pillowcase seams were aligned, whether the person who had cleaned the room had actually been present to what they were doing or had simply moved through it. Greta promoted Clara to front desk after 8 months, which was the fastest she had ever promoted anyone from housekeeping, and told her only, "You're thorough. That quality will take you places if you don't let other people talk you out of it." Clara had not let anyone talk her out of it. She moved from front desk to night audit at 24, from audit to floor supervision at 26, from supervision to assistant operations manager at the Meridian Harbor Hotel at 28. The Meridian Harbor was a full-service downtown property with 240 rooms and a food and beverage operation that ran from breakfast service at 6 in the morning to the hotel bar, closing at 2. She managed daily operations across every department: front desk, housekeeping, maintenance, food service, events. She handled vendor negotiations, staff scheduling, the monthly inventory audit, the weekly revenue review, and the constant low-level crisis management that any operating hotel generated simply by existing as a place where human beings interacted with systems designed by other human beings under imperfect conditions. 6 years in that role. 6 years of early arrivals and late departures and learning every system in that building well enough to explain any one of them from memory at 2 in the morning when a problem surfaced and the person responsible for it was unreachable. The parent company restructured in June. The email arrived on a Thursday afternoon while Clara was in the middle of reviewing food and beverage invoices she had been working through since 8 that morning. It used phrases like organizational realignment and position elimination and effective at the close of business today. The email was copied to her direct supervisor and the regional HR director, which meant the decision had been made and communicated in a sequence that had not included her, which was its own specific category of information about how she had been regarded. She read it twice, closed it, finished reviewing the invoices, submitted them through the internal system before 5 o'clock. She took the elevator down to the lobby and walked through the Meridian Harbor's main entrance for the last time. She did not stop to speak with the front desk staff, not because she did not care about them, but because she did not yet have words for this situation that were not either dishonest or more than she could manage in a lobby with guests moving through it. She drove to Marco's after-school program and picked him up, stopped at the grocery store on the way home, made dinner, helped Marco with his homework, read with him for 20 minutes after dinner before bed. All of it normal in its execution, all of it performed with the focus of someone who understands that normalcy for children is not incidental, but is itself a form of work. After Marco was asleep, she sat down at the kitchen table with Sophia and told her what had happened. Sophia was 14. She listened to the whole of it without interrupting. When Clara finished, she asked, "What are we going to do?" Clara said, "I'm going to find work. You don't need to worry about this." Sophia looked at her for a long moment with the look that teenagers develop when they have learned to parse what their parents are not saying. Then she went back to her homework, which was itself an answer, a quiet confirmation that she had understood the situation and was not going to add to it. That night, after the apartment was quiet, and she could hear Sophia's soft breathing through the wall and Marco's deeper sleep from his room, Clara opened her notebook to a new page and wrote the numbers down. What they needed each month to maintain their current situation. What the severance covered. What unemployment would provide if she applied immediately and was approved at the standard rate. How many months those resources would sustain them before the gap between what came in and what went out became too wide to paper over with adjustments to the grocery list and delays to the dentist. The answer was 5 months, perhaps 6 with discipline management. She had not permitted herself to arrive at month 4 before finding work. That was 14 months before she found the posting on the state board. Nighttime security and property monitor, temporary assignment. Foreclosed asset, the Calloway Grand Hotel, downtown district. Pay, $16 per hour plus a 15% overnight differential. Duration, 90 days. Before we go any further, if this story already has your attention, take a second right now and hit subscribe. Drop a comment below telling us what you would have done in Clara's situation. What she found in that hotel is going to take this somewhere none of us expected, and we are just getting started. The 14 months between the Meridian Harbor and the Calloway Grand were the kind of 14 months that leave a specific mark, not a visible one. The kind carried in the particular way you respond to certain questions, in the careful neutral expression you maintain when someone asks how things are going in a context where the real answer is not welcome. She had found work within 3 weeks of the termination because she was not someone who waited for arrangements to present themselves. The sandwich counter on Breckenridge Avenue took her on for the lunch shift, 6:45 in the morning to 2:30 in the afternoon, 5 days per week. A janitorial company on Route 3 hired her for 3 nights per week cleaning commercial office suites, 9 at night until 1 in the morning. During months when the regular driver was out sick, she picked up a weekend shuttle shift at an airport hotel 10 miles from downtown. She accumulated hours the way someone bails water, continuously, without stopping, because stopping was not a category the arithmetic permitted. The math was never comfortable. It occupied the space between tight and manageable, which is a space that has no comfortable floor. Rent on the 3rd floor 2-bedroom was $1,200. Utilities averaged $240. Groceries for $3. Purchased with the careful attention of someone who did not permit herself to buy anything that was not on the list and had built the list around what they actually needed rather than what they might prefer, ran to about $480 per month. Marco's school lunch account required $120 each time she refilled it. Sophia's bus pass was $42. The winter coat that replaced the previous one when the lining tore beyond repair was $80 from the consignment shop on 5th. The only coat in the store in Sophia's size that was both functional and not embarrassing for a 16-year-old to wear, and Clara had paid for it without blinking while feeling the $80 as a specific physical weight. She managed. She had stopped conflating managing with being fine sometime around month 3. Her sister Diane called the morning Clara submitted the Calloway Grand application. They spoke twice a week, and the calls followed a reliable pattern. Diane would ask how things were going, which Clara would answer honestly with facts rather than feelings. Diane would then offer a perspective on the facts that proceeded from the assumption that Clara's current circumstances were the result of choices that could have been made differently and could still be made differently now. Clara would respond to the perspective with patience. The call would end with arrangements for the following week's call. "You're applying to babysit an empty building," Diane said. "I'm applying for a position that pays $18.40 an hour after differential, works around the children's schedule, and doesn't require a commute longer than 12 minutes. Clara, you have a hotel management certificate. You have 6 years at a management level. You should be in a role that uses those qualifications, not watching over a building that the bank is trying to unload. I'm not in a position to be in a management role right now. Management positions require day availability, which conflicts with Sophia's SAT prep schedule on Tuesday and Thursday mornings and Marco's school pickup on the days the program ends at 2. A night shift solves both of those problems simultaneously. Put Marco in extended care. Extended care is $420 per month. The math does not improve." Diane was quiet for a moment. "Elena called me." Clara set down her coffee mug. "She said Diego would be open to taking the kids full-time while you stabilize yourself." She framed it as an offer of assistance. She said it might be better for the children to have a more consistent household arrangement. Diego has canceled 3 consecutive visits. The most recent time, he sent a text message 40 minutes after his scheduled pickup time with no explanation and no offer to reschedule. He does not have the standing to present his pattern of absence as a form of stability. "I'm passing along what she said. I understand. Thank you for passing it along." She ended the call and went back to the kitchen table, where the budget notebook lay open. She looked at the 2 columns for a moment without picking up the pen. Then she filed the Calloway Grand application online and made herself a second cup of coffee. Diego Vega had left when Marco was 5 and Sofia was 12, not in a single departure, but through a long series of increasingly extended absences, each one slightly longer than the previous, until the absence became the pattern and the return became the exception, and then the exception stopped. He paid child support on time through the county's automated system, which was the most consistent thing he had done in the children's lives since leaving, and Clara had reached a point of accepting this as the reality without spending energy on what it should have been instead. She did not speak to the children about their father in any way that required them to form a position on him. Children formed their own positions when they were old enough to have the full picture, and those positions would be more accurate and more their own than anything she shaped now. What Sofia had formed at 16 was an understanding that her best path forward ran directly through her own academic performance and nowhere else. She treated the university application process with the focused seriousness of someone on a deadline that felt personal rather than institutional, because it was. She had enrolled in 2 advanced placement courses on top of her standard load. She had signed up for the school's fee waiver SAT preparation program and attended every Saturday session. She had already researched which state universities offered the strongest financial aid packages for students who met the academic threshold, and she had calibrated her application list accordingly. She was 16. She was doing the same math her mother did, just with a different set of numbers. Marco was 9 and interested primarily in prehistoric megafauna, the structural properties of cardboard, and the ongoing argument about which of his classmates had the best video game collection. He was cheerful in a way that had held through the past 14 months without any apparent effort, which Clara sometimes thought was the most remarkable thing she had witnessed in the entire period. She told them about the Calloway Grand position over dinner on a Tuesday. "What kind of hotel is it?" Marco asked. "A very old one. Built in 1931, which is before your grandfather was born. It's been closed for about a year. The bank is in charge of it now while they work out the ownership situation. And you walk around in it at night by yourself?" "That's the job. I check that everything is in the right condition and log it in the system." He turned this over for a moment. "Are there ghosts?" "No." "How do you know?" "Buildings don't have ghosts, Marco. They have history, which sounds similar but is completely different." He was not fully satisfied with this answer but accepted it, which was generally how their conversations on metaphysically contested topics concluded. Sofia, across the table, was looking at Clara with the particular look she had developed in the past year, the one that sat between assessment and worry, the one Clara recognized because she made the same face in the bathroom mirror on mornings when the budget notebook had not resolved in her favor. "Does it pay enough?" Sofia asked. "Yes. You'll be alone in the building all night. The building is empty. I've worked in hotels for 15 years. The context is different, but the work itself isn't. It's a little scary, Mom. A lot of things are a little scary. Most of them are manageable." Sofia held her look for another moment and then returned to her dinner. It was the kind of conversation they had developed a shorthand for. Sofia raised the concern. Clara confirmed she had considered it. Neither of them expanded beyond what was necessary. It was an efficient way to handle situations where the realistic options were limited, and the purpose of the conversation was confirmation rather than deliberation. Keith Ashby met Clara at the Calloway Grand service entrance on the alley side of the building on her first evening. He was perhaps 45, wearing the bank's logo on a fleece pullover he had worn over a dress shirt in a combination that suggested he had not fully settled on how professional a foreclosure monitoring assignment warranted. He had a clipboard with a printed checklist and worked through the property onboarding with the efficiency of someone who had presented the same material multiple times and had reduced it to its minimum necessary components. Utilities, minimal. Heat maintained at 55 degrees in the accessible zones. Cold above the second floor, especially in the stairwells where the original exterior walls provided almost no modern insulation. Lighting, motion triggered in the corridors and stairwells. Emergency circuit in the lobby and the first-floor public spaces. Above that, she would be working primarily with her flashlight supplemented by sensor-activated fixtures that required a moment to recognize her. Access, floors 1 through 10 available. Floors 11 through 14 quarantined per a structural assessment from the previous spring. The issues identified were not catastrophic, Ashby said, But the liability exposure was not a risk the bank's legal department was prepared to accept while the property sat in limbo. The previous monitors mostly stayed on the first 2 floors, he said. You can hit all 12 reader stations without going higher than 3. I'll do the full route, Clara said. He handed her the key ring, 23 labeled keys on a steel ring with a tag identifying the property. He gave her the laminated card showing the 12 reader station positions and their 2-hour requirement. He walked her through the management office on the 2nd floor. Folding table, laptop, space heater, small refrigerator with 2 water bottles, and a single protein bar, fluorescent fixture overhead humming at a frequency that would eventually become background. Questions, he asked. The 3 previous monitors. Why did each one leave? He checked his clipboard with the manner of someone consulting a record rather than recalling from memory. First one lasted 9 days. He said the building made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't specify. Second found a higher rate at a commercial property in the North District. Third had a family situation requiring a day shift. How long has nighttime coverage been absent? 6 weeks. She nodded. He gathered his materials and made a movement toward the door indicating the handoff was complete. Then he paused and pointed to the folding table. There was a thermos he had apparently set there during his setup, which she had not noticed. He said she was welcome to it. She thanked him. He said good luck in the register of a contractual obligation being discharged rather than a genuine wish, and left. She stood in the management office alone with the thermos and the key ring and the particular hum of the fluorescent light and listened to the building settle around her. The lobby was the first thing that told her what the Calloway Grand had been. She walked it. Slowly on her first night, flashlights supplementing the amber glow of the emergency fixtures set every 12 feet into the baseboards. The floor was original marble, white with black diamond inlays in a geometric pattern that covered the full expanse of the space. The stone scratched and filmed but intact in its essential structure in a way that testified to the quality of the original installation. The ceiling rose 20 feet, coffered in pale gold plasterwork whose patterns had survived decades without maintenance in a way that suggested either excellent original materials or exceptional luck, or both. For chandeliers on heavy chains overhead. Dark, dust-filmed but present, their glass catching the emergency light below and breaking it into faint prismatic scatterings on the walls. The check-in desk in mahogany and marble, its surface holding pale ghost outlines of where telephones and ledgers had rested. The wooden key cubbies behind the desk, brass-numbered, some still holding their original room keys on heavy fobs. Clara ran her hand along the cold marble edge of the desk and let the word arrive. Grand, not in the sense of physical scale, though the hotel was large. In the older sense of the word, the sense of a building designed to make a statement about its city and to be worthy of the people it invited in. She walked through the lobby into the bar, where the mahogany bar itself was still in position, back bar intact, mirror surface filmed but unbroken. Through the bar into the formal dining room, round tables still standing with their bases, the ghost outlines of place settings visible in the dust on each table surface. Into the kitchen through the swing door, cast iron range, walk-in cooler with its door propped open to prevent mold, stainless prep surfaces oxidized to flat gray. On the kitchen wall beside the dry goods pantry, penciled in someone's careful handwriting, soup du jour, Thursday special, check bread delivery. She stood and read the note. Then she went back through the building and upstairs. Her overlap counterpart at the property was a man named Prentice who handled the daytime check-in shifts, 9 to 5 on weekdays, and arrived at the building 30 to 60 minutes after Clara's shift ended on mornings. He started early. He had worked enough temporary monitoring assignments at foreclosed and underperforming properties to have developed a comprehensive philosophy about the category, and he shared it freely in the brief windows where their schedules intersected. The reader log is not checked in real time, he told her on a Thursday morning, lifting her thermos without asking and pouring himself a cup while she finished her shift notes. I've confirmed this independently. You complete all 12 sweeps in the first 90 minutes, then do whatever you want for the remaining hours. The bank system only requires the timestamps. Nobody checks the spacing. That's not how I work, Clara said. I know. You've got that face. What face? Like you believe it matters whether you do this right even when nobody's watching. He returned the thermos. I don't mean that critically. It's just unusual in this kind of position. She said nothing to that. He finished his cup and went to set up his station. The exchange stayed with her longer than it warranted. She had spent 15 years believing that doing the job correctly was the floor, the baseline below which a person did not go regardless of audience or incentive. The Meridian Harbor had terminated her position anyway, without reference to her thoroughness. The sandwich counter did not distinguish between careful and approximate as long as the line moved. The janitorial company's owner had never once inspected the suites she cleaned. She continued doing the job right because the alternative was becoming someone who did not, and that felt like a more permanent loss than the others she had absorbed. By her third week, she had developed the particular familiarity with the Calloway Grand that comes from spending concentrated time in any place that does not give you much back in return. She knew the second-floor corridor lights took 4 seconds to trigger from the motion sensors, long enough to produce a disorienting brief darkness if you moved off the stairwell too quickly. She knew the service elevator rattled on ascent and ran smooth on descent, suggesting a loose guide on the upper pulley rather than a problem with the drive mechanism. She knew the 5th-floor east window looked over a parking structure and caught enough ambient city light to see by on clear nights. She knew the building's sound. The structural breadth of a limestone building carrying 90 years of its own weight through each night's temperature shift, a slow expansion along the load-bearing beams when the heat came on, a contraction when it cycled off, a sound less like a creak than like a very deep and very slow exhale. The pipes moved in the walls when the boiler cycled at 2 in the morning, a rhythmic knock that traveled up the east side of the building in a pattern she had mapped without intending to. The old mechanics of the place, still functioning, still working through their routines in the dark. She found, in those late hours, that the Calloway Grand rewarded attention. Not with comfort. It was cold above the second floor, the cold of a building whose insulation standards belonged to 1931. Not with ease. The emergency lighting was sufficient to move by, but not to see clearly, and her flashlight was always in her hand on the upper floors. What the building offered, to someone willing to walk it and pay attention, was information. Specific information about a specific place that had been a specific thing for a long time before becoming what it was now. The hotel's history accumulated in details she would not have noticed if she had worked here when it was active. The dining room table set for people who had not come. The kitchen prep note for a Thursday that had never arrived. Height marks penciled on the door frame of a second-floor storage closet. Inspection 1948. Inspection 1961, Inspection 1979. The date sequence said something about how seriously George had taken the building's maintenance in the years when he could still afford to take it seriously, and said something else about what had happened to that capacity over time. The Calloway Grand's ghosts were not the kind Marco had asked about. They were the ordinary residue of a place that had been active and then had not been. Evidence of continuous effort now interrupted, presence preserved in the materials left behind. She found them, on the whole, more companionable than unsettling. The building had been cared for. That quality of former care was still legible in the bones of the place, even if it was no longer maintained in its surface condition. She understood the difference between the two, having spent her career in hotels where the distinction was the entire point of the work. She read the property file on her first night, slowly, in the management office with the space heater running. George Calloway I had built the hotel in 1931, commissioning the design from an architect who appeared in historical records as a specialist in the commercial style of the late 1920s. George II expanded the rooftop terrace in 58 and updated the kitchen in 62. George III, referred to throughout the bank's documents simply as George, had operated the hotel from 1971 until his death 3 years earlier. No wife, no children. A nephew's challenge to the estate had not survived probate. The bank was the primary creditor. She found George's obituary in the Historical Society's archive during her second week. It described him as a man who had maintained the Calloway Grand's commitment to personal service and privacy in an era that valued neither, and who had refused multiple acquisition offers because he believed the hotel's character could not survive a change in ownership. He had died at 78, still resident in a small second-floor suite. A 1979 newspaper feature had quoted him on the subject of his hotel's philosophy. She stopped on the quote and read it twice. George had said, "The Calloway Grand has always understood its relationship with its guests as something beyond a commercial arrangement. Some guests become part of what this building is. That is not something I am prepared to reduce to an occupancy figure. She kept reading. A brief November 1987 business section item noted that the Calloway Grand had entered a private accommodation arrangement with an out-of-state guest, later identified in a follow-up reference as Arthur Harlow, for permanent residence in a sixth-floor room for the purposes of secure storage and personal use. She found Arthur Harlow in a 1983 regional magazine profile of private collectors. He was photographed before a painting, heavy set, perhaps 60, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive in the way expensive things look when the person wearing them does not particularly need them to look expensive. The caption described him as a specialist in rare art, numismatic collections, and instruments of private finance, known for operating at the margins of the conventional market. She found his name on an attendee list for a private collectors summit in 1984. Found him referenced as the buyer in a closed regional auction in 1986, where he had purchased an early 18th century Dutch oil painting and a collection of ancient gold coins. Found his name in the Calloway Grand's November 1987 guest register, digitized by the Historical Society as part of their downtown business records collection. A. Harlow. Room 606. Extended stay. No checkout date. She found a 1994 probate filing for Arthur Harlow's estate. Missing since early 1988. Presumed deceased after 7 years without contact. The estate had yielded minimal identifiable assets because Harlow appeared to have converted the majority of his holdings in the years before his disappearance to bearer instruments and physical assets of unlocated origin. Physical assets, unlocated. What the fragments added up to was the outline of a man who had spent his adult life converting wealth into objects and objects into privacy. Bearer instruments left no name in any registry. Physical assets, correctly maintained, could be held and moved without entering any system that required documentation of the transaction. Arthur Harlow had operated at the margins of the conventional market, as the magazine profile phrased it, and what that meant in practice was that he had structured his holdings to exist outside the documentary record that most significant wealth left behind. He had arrived at the Calloway Grand in November of 1987 with the things he valued most. He had arranged with George Calloway for a private accommodation whose terms the newspapers described only in the vaguest language, and had settled into the corner room on the 6th floor with his cases and his canvases and his safes, and the understanding, presumably, that George was the kind of owner whose relationship with his guests extended beyond what was formally required. And then in the early weeks of 1988, he had stopped being seen. No departure recorded. No forwarding address established. No communication to anyone, as far as the probate filing indicated, that he was leaving or where he intended to go. George had sealed the room in January of that year, as if the sealing itself was the fulfillment of a private obligation, as if the arrangement between them had included a provision for this. If one party ceased to be present, the other would preserve what had been left behind until the terms of the arrangement resolved themselves, or someone came looking who had the right to look. For 37 years, no one had. She found one more document, an internal memorandum dated January of 1988, on Calloway Grand letterhead, initialed GC. It stated that Room 606 was under private arrangement per ownership direction and that standard housekeeping and access protocols did not apply to the accommodation effective immediately. George Calloway had sealed the room himself in January of 1988, at the point when Arthur Harlow, according to the probate timeline, had stopped being seen anywhere. She had found the missing room 3 nights before she found these records, on a Wednesday round in her 4th week. Walking the 6th floor corridor on her 2nd sweep of the shift, and something in the peripheral processing of someone who has walked the same route enough times finally registered. The room numbers were wrong. 601, 602, 603, 604, 605, a gap, 607, 608. She walked back slowly and stood at the wall between 605 and 607 and raised her flashlight. The baseboard trim at that position was fractionally thicker than the surrounding trim. A difference too small to see in ordinary light, unmistakable under a raking flashlight beam that caught the shadow of the offset against the wall. She ran her knuckles along the wall at door height and heard the sound shift from the solid response of plaster over brick to the lighter, hollow return of a void behind the surface. A door had been covered, not removed, sealed behind a carefully applied plaster facing. The work skilled enough to pass an ordinary inspection, thorough enough to have remained undetected for 37 years by 3 previous monitors and whatever structural assessors had walked the building during the bank's due diligence process. She went back to the management office and found the original architectural floor plan in the bank's intake documentation. 606 was on the plan. Corner room. Deluxe single. Before we find out what happened next in the story, I want to take a brief moment to speak directly to anyone watching who might be going through their own sudden, overwhelming transition. If you are navigating a bitter divorce, the loss of a spouse, or a financial shock, you know the hardest part isn't just the money. It's not knowing what to do first. That is exactly why we created the Phoenix Blueprint. It is a practical, step-by-step guide for starting over. It doesn't have fluffy affirmations or vision boards. It is a tactical survival manual. It gives you the exact checklist for the first 48 hours, including the one rule you must follow. Do not make any decision you cannot reverse. It includes the Found Money worksheet, showing you exactly how to check state databases because 1 in 7 Americans actually has unclaimed money waiting for them right now. It even gives you word-for-word boundary scripts to use when family members pressure you for money or try to make decisions for you. You can get the entire guide right now for just $17. If you're watching on your TV, just pull out your phone, open your camera, and scan the QR code on the screen right now. If you're on a computer or phone, click the top link in the description. You don't have to figure this out alone. Now, let's get back to the story. Entry from the south corridor. 2 exterior windows, 1 north-facing and 1 east-facing. She returned upstairs and found, at floor level in the beam of her flashlight, the seam in the baseboard that traced the original door frame, a rectangle approximately 36 inches wide and close to 7 feet tall. The door was still there, sealed inside the false wall. She stood in front of it for a while before going back downstairs. Standing there in the corridor with her flashlight on the baseboard seam, she was doing the calculation she did with every unfamiliar situation. What she knew, what she did not know, and what she needed to find out before she could determine what to do. What she knew was that a door had been sealed from the outside sometime in the past, done by a professional or someone with a professional skill and patience. What she did not know was what was behind it, though she had a growing sense that the shape of what was behind it was connected to everything she had been reading about Arthur Harlow and his physical assets of unlocated origin. What she needed to find out, before she did anything, was whether there was a legal framework for what she was considering. She was not a woman who acted first and thought afterward. She had learned in 15 years of hotel management that the decisions you regret are almost always the ones you made too fast, in the window before you had the full picture. The hotel industry ran on systems precisely because ad hoc decisions in the moment, however well-intentioned, created problems that took far longer to resolve than the original situation would have. She went back downstairs. She spent the 3 days following her discovery of the room doing research on 2 tracks simultaneously. The historical track, which was Arthur Harlow and his connection to room 606, and the legal track, which was what rights and obligations applied when someone in her position found something like this in a property controlled by a bank during a foreclosure period. The legal track was less straightforward than she had hoped and more nuanced than she had feared. The law school acquaintance she called, a woman named Adrian who had gone into estate recovery after spending 5 years at a general practice firm, said, "The core question is whether the items in the room belong to the estate of Arthur Harlow, to the estate of George Calloway, to the bank as the current property holder, or to some combination of the 3. There is case law on all of these positions. None of them result in an obvious clean outcome. What matters enormously is how the discovery is handled and documented." Clara asked, "What happens if the bank finds out before I understand my position?" Adrian was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The bank's instinct will be to treat everything in that building as part of the asset they are liquidating. Whether or not that is legally correct is a different question. But practically speaking, the bank has more lawyers than you do, and they will move faster than you will if they know about it first." Clara thanked her. She asked one more question. "Is there such a thing as a finder's provision? Something that would entitle the person who discovered the room to a portion of what's in it?" Adrian said, "Depends entirely on whether anyone made one. Did the previous owner leave any legal documents? Clara said she did not know yet. Adrian said, find out before you open that door. Or at least, find out at the same time. She did not touch it that night. She went back downstairs and finished her shift and drove home in the early morning and sat at the kitchen table and thought about a collector who had checked into this hotel in the fall of 1987 and never officially checked out, and about physical assets of unlocated origin, and about what it meant that a man who valued long relationships with his guests had sealed a room in January of the following year and never documented why. She thought about these things for 3 days. During those 3 days, she made 2 calls. The first to a law school acquaintance whose practice included estate recovery situations. The second to a woman found through a legal directory who described her work as asset authentication and provenance research. She did not give either of them specifics. She described the situation in general terms. The first said, if this is what it sounds like, do not speak to the bank first. Property rights in discovered asset situations involving unsettled estates and third-party real estate claims are genuinely complex. Document everything before you disclose anything to anyone with a financial interest in the property. The second said, if there are paintings and significant physical objects, the documentation sequence matters enormously. Photographs before contact. Condition notes. Everything in order. Chain of custody in situations like this is everything. Clara thanked both of them and said she would be in touch. She went back to the 6th floor on a Wednesday night, her 5th week on the assignment. She brought her pocket knife and a flashlight with a fresh battery. She worked along the baseboard seam with the knife's thin blade, testing the plaster at the margins. It released cleanly, not crumbling but giving it the joint, the way material gives when applied over an existing surface rather than bonded to original construction. She worked a section free above the door handle position, about 8 inches by 12, and when she held the flashlight at the edge, she saw the original brass lever handle beneath it. 1931 hardware. Heavy and substantial. It had been there for 90 years. The plaster facing over it had been there for 37. She tried the key ring. She tried them in order, not randomly, because she was a methodical person and there was no reason to abandon that now. The second key turned the lock. The door swung inward on hinges that had been still since 1988. It moved steadily, because the mechanism was sound even if the occasion was long overdue. The seal between the door and the frame released, and the air that had been held since the winter of that year met her face. Cold, stale, cedar and something mineral underneath, the smell that belongs to very old things kept in perfect darkness over a very long time. She raised the flashlight. Canvases first, stacked along the far wall, a dozen or more, each covered in cloth sheeting that had grayed from white but held its integrity. Each frame upright and organized, placed with care that was unmistakably intentional. This was not hasty storage. This was deliberate preservation by someone who understood what he was leaving behind and intended it to survive. Cases next. 12 wooden cases arranged with precise organization along the east wall, brass-clasped, leather-handled, the kind designed for objects requiring serious protection across serious distances. Dusty but undamaged. The wood still sound after 37 years. 2 metal safes in the far corner, each approximately 4 feet tall. Combination dials facing outward. They sat on the hotel carpet with the settled weight of objects that had not been moved in decades, their surfaces carrying the thin, even dust of long undisturbed rooms. Nothing had touched these safes since they were placed. Both windows were covered. Plywood panels fitted to the frames and painted on the outside to match the building's limestone exterior. No light in, no light out. The room had been made invisible in every direction and had stayed that way. Clara stood in the doorway. She had allowed herself, during the 3 days of research and the 3 nights of thinking about it afterward, to consider that the room might contain something significant. She had not permitted herself to be specific. Specificity invited a particular kind of hope, and that kind of hope could make you impulsive, could make you talk to the wrong person too soon, could make you act before you understood what you were acting from. She stood in the doorway with the flashlight beam on the near edge of the first covered canvas and held the situation in her mind for a full minute. She was 34 years old. She had $412 in savings after the month's bills cleared. She had a daughter quietly working a part-time tutoring job to contribute something toward her own application fees, because she understood the budget well enough to know the contribution would matter. She had a son who had needed $2 for a field trip and had not asked twice because he had read the situation accurately and drawn his own conclusions about what to ask for. She had taken the worst shift in an empty building because the overnight differential was the difference between barely enough and not enough. And she was standing in the doorway of a sealed room looking at covered paintings and locked cases and 2 untouched safes. She was aware of her own breathing in the doorway. The steadiness of it was a choice rather than a condition. She had developed a specific relationship, over 15 years of hotel work, with situations that required you to function calmly, while managing information your nervous system was processing at a different register than your professional mind. A guest having a medical emergency in a room, a fire alarm at 3 in the morning, guests in the corridor, the question of which elevator shaft was clear. The Meridian Harbor had flooded a basement level once, in a storm that overwhelmed the drainage system, and Clara had spent 4 hours directing the salvage of the F&B storage while the water was still rising. You did not stop functioning in those situations. You shifted into a mode that was precise and sequential, and that kept your hands moving even when your mind was processing something much larger. She was in that mode now. The room was larger than it appeared from the doorway. The plywood over the windows had preserved not just the darkness, but the original condition of everything inside, shielding it from ultraviolet light that would have damaged the canvases over 3 decades, maintaining a consistent temperature that had kept the wooden cases from warping and the fabric coverings from deteriorating beyond the slow graying she could see. Someone had prepared this room for long-term preservation, not just sealed it and walked away. Prepared it. The plywood over the windows was not an afterthought. She could see from the doorway that it had been fitted with care, sealed at the edges, painted on the exterior to match the limestone so that anyone looking at the building from outside would see nothing but the expected surface of a corner room. The cloth covers on the canvases were not bed sheets or tarps, but actual archival-grade storage covers, the kind that cost real money and were sold by specialist suppliers. The cases along the east wall were fitted cases, made for specific objects and padded for long-term storage. Arthur Harlow, or someone who had understood his intentions, had prepared this room for the possibility that it would remain sealed for a very long time. She thought about that for a moment, about what it meant to prepare something for permanence, about what a person was communicating when they sealed a room with this level of care rather than simply locking it and hoping for the best. He had known he was leaving, or he had known there was a significant possibility he might not return, and he had prepared accordingly. She pulled out her phone and began taking photographs. She did not step into the room. She stood at the threshold and documented everything the flashlight revealed, one area at a time, moving methodically from left to right and then floor to ceiling, the way 15 years of hotel operations had trained her to approach any situation requiring a record before any action. She photographed the cases from multiple angles, the safes, the covered canvases, the plywood-covered windows, the layer of undisturbed dust on every horizontal surface, the completeness of the stillness, the way nothing had been touched. Then she stepped back. She replaced the plaster section over the handle and pressed it into position. She walked back down the corridor, down the stairwell, into the management office. She sat in the folding chair and did not write in the log for a while. The space heater ran. The fluorescent light hummed. The city moved through its late hours outside the window. At 5:30, the first morning light came through the glass. She picked up her phone and called the authentication researcher she had spoken to 3 days before. She said, "I need you to come look at something. I need you to come soon. And before you agree, I need you to understand that the institution currently holding title to this building is not going to know about this conversation until I have a clear picture of what I am dealing with and what my legal position is." The researcher was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Tell me more." Clara told her. She thought, sitting in the folding chair in the early morning light, about what it meant that she was the one who had found this. 3 previous monitors had walked the 6th-floor corridor and not noticed the gap in the room sequence. She had walked it 7 times before noticing it herself. The building had been sitting in the bank's portfolio for 8 months before she arrived. Whatever had been in room 606 had been waiting for 37 years, and it had waited through all of that without being found. She thought about the field trip permission slip Marco had needed last week. $2. She had found it in the pocket of a jacket she had not worn in 3 months. She thought about Sophia's application fees, the specific amounts she had researched, the gap between what she had saved and what the actual deadlines would require. She thought about Diane calling it babysitting an empty building. She thought about Keith Ashby saying good luck in the tone of a person fulfilling a contractual formality. She did not know yet what she was dealing with. She knew only the outline. A sealed room, a collection of objects whose age and apparent quality suggested significant value. A man who had disappeared in 1988 after converting his assets to things that did not exist in any registry. She did not know whether there was a legal framework that protected her position. She did not know whether Arthur Harlow's estate had been fully closed or whether it remained technically open. She did not know what a finder's provision looked like, or whether one existed, or whether anyone had ever thought to make one in this specific situation. She was going to find out, in the right order, before she told anyone at the bank, and before she did anything that could not be undone. She sat with that until the city outside the window was fully light. Then she called the authentication researcher and said what needed to be said. She did not know, that morning, what the canvases showed. She did not know what the 12 cases contained or what combination would open the two safes. She did not know that the total value of what Arthur Harlow had brought to room 606 of the Calloway Grand in the fall of 1987 would be assessed 6 weeks later at $140 million. She did not know about the document sealed inside one of those cases since 1987, prepared by Arthur Harlow with specific legal language for exactly this scenario. The person who finally opened the door knowing nothing of the will, knowing only that they had been paying attention in a building where everyone else had stopped. She only knew she had found something real in a place where everyone else had stopped looking, on a shift everyone else had refused to take, and that she was going to be very careful about every single step that came next. She was Clara Vega. She had always been thorough. The call lasted 42 minutes. Clara sat in the management office at the folding table while the early morning light widened in the window, and she told Celeste Drummond everything in the order it had happened. Not the order she had felt it. The order it could be verified, because that was what Celeste would need. Celeste asked 2 clarifying questions during the entire conversation. First, whether Clara had entered the room beyond the doorway threshold. Clara said no. Second, whether anyone at the bank or the asset management firm had been notified of the discovery. Clara said no. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would drive up that morning and asked Clara to remain in the building until she arrived. She asked her not to speak to anyone in the interim. Clara said she understood. She sat at the folding table after the call and looked at the space heater and the mini fridge and the fluorescent light overhead, which had been buzzing at a slightly different frequency for the past 2 weeks, a small persistent irritation she had stopped hearing. She thought about the field trip permission slip again. $2. She had found the coins in the pocket of a jacket she had not worn since the previous winter. She thought about what it meant that the only thing she had been looking for during the weeks she spent learning the Calloway Grand were problems to document and readers to swipe, and that she had still found this. She drove home at 6:15, got Marco to school at 7:40, and was back at the hotel by 9. Celeste arrived at 9:17. She parked a gray sedan in the permit lot and came through the service entrance carrying a leather case the size of a large briefcase, worn at the corners with the honest wear of something used professionally over a long career. She was 51, compact, with reading glasses pushed up on her head and the deliberate, unhurried economy of movement that Clara had encountered before in people whose work required it. Hotel doctors moved like that. Insurance adjusters sometimes. People who spent their days around things that could not be undone if they moved carelessly. She shook Clara's hand and asked to see the floor plan before they went upstairs. Clara spread the architectural drawing on the folding table. Celeste studied it without speaking for 4 minutes, tracing the 6th floor layout with a finger that did not quite touch the paper. When she was done, she looked up and asked how many people had knowledge of the calls Clara had made 3 days ago. Clara said 2. Celeste herself, and an attorney contact to whom she had given only the broad outlines, no specifics. Celeste nodded once. She picked up her case and said, "Let's go." The 6th floor corridor looked exactly as it always did. Worn brown carpet, emergency lighting at intervals, doors swollen in their frames from years of inconsistent climate. Room 605 on the left side, 607 on the right, and between them the wall that did not match if you understood what to look for. Celeste stopped in front of it. She crouched and examined the baseboard with a flashlight she had taken from her case, running the beam along the seam at floor level without touching anything. She stood and looked at Clara. She said, "You noticed this during routine rounds." Clara confirmed that. Celeste said, "How many times had you walked this corridor before you saw it?" Clara said, 7. Celeste was quiet for a moment. She said, "Most people stop registering what is in front of them after about the third repetition of the same space. 7 is actually rather good." Clara did not know what to say to that. She used her pocket knife to work the plaster section free, moving along the line she had already opened and replaced once before. The section came away more cleanly this time, in about 80 seconds. She stepped back so Celeste could see the original brass lever handle and the keyhole beneath it. Celeste leaned in close. She put on latex gloves from her case. She examined the handle and the keyhole for a long time without touching either. Then she said, "The key, please." The door swung inward for the second time. Celeste stood at the threshold and was completely still for 2 full minutes. She held her flashlight on the room but kept it moving slowly, not settling on any particular object, taking the whole space in together before narrowing her attention. Clara stood behind her in the corridor and waited, aware of her own breathing in a way she had not been since the first time she had opened this door. The sealed air moved past them both. Cedar and something underneath it that was harder to name. The smell that belonged to very old things preserved in unbroken darkness over a very long time. Then Celeste stepped inside. She crossed to the nearest canvas first and crouched to examine the cloth covering at the bottom without lifting it, studying the material itself, the texture and age of the fabric. She moved to a second canvas and did the same. She ran a gloved finger along the edge of one of the wooden cases and examined what came away on the glove. She straightened and stood for a moment with her flashlight sweeping the room in a slow arc from left to right. Then she said, "More light." Clara retrieved the second flashlight from her bag and positioned herself so the 2 beams covered the room from different angles. Celeste went to the first canvas and began lifting the cloth cover from the bottom edge, gathering the fabric upward with both hands rather than pulling it away, minimizing the motion near the surface below. A frame emerged first, gilded wood. The gilt darkened to a warm brown, but structurally intact with no visible damage at the corners or the joints. Then the canvas itself came into view. Clara was not an expert in paintings. She had visited the downtown art museum twice, once in childhood and once when Marco was small, and she had looked at the works there with a general appreciation without the knowledge to go further. What she could see in the flashlight beams now was that the surface of the painting carried depth in a way that seemed at odds with something that was only a flat object. The paint had layers to it that she perceived more than saw, the way you perceive depth in water without being able to point to where the surface ends and the interior begins. The subject was a harbor. Ships in 3/4 profile, sails lit from one side by a particular northern quality of light, the water below them rendered in strokes that described movement without illustrating it. Celeste produced a loupe from her case and examined the lower right corner for a long time. She moved to the lower left corner. She looked there for a long time too. Then she stood and turned to Clara. She said, "What I am able to tell you in this room, at this moment, is that this is not a collection of reproductions. I want to be precise about that because I am not going to give you attributions or figures today. Authentication of works like these requires controlled conditions and a process I cannot complete here. What I am telling you is the negative. This is not what it would be if it were worthless. Do you understand the distinction?" Clara said she did. They spent 3 hours in the room that morning. Celeste worked through each of the 12 canvases in the same methodical sequence. Photograph the exterior of the cover, lift from the bottom, document the work. The subjects varied. A harbor scene, a still life with fruit and pewter objects arranged with the serious attention that the Northern European tradition brought to ordinary things. A portrait of a seated figure in dark clothing, the hands rendered with a specificity that Clara found herself looking at longer than the face. A landscape with a low horizon and the kind of wide sky that required skill to make interesting. A devotional scene, an interior with a woman at a window. 6 more, varying in scale from quite small to one that was nearly 4 feet across. 2 of the 12 had secondary canvases lined to their backs. a conservation technique Celeste explained was applied to paintings considered significant enough to warrant the extra layer of protection against canvas degradation. She said this more to herself than to Clara, the way professionals narrate what they are observing as a way of keeping their documentation precise. Clara sat on the edge of the stripped hotel mattress and watched her work, and thought about Keith Ashby and his clipboard and the thermos of coffee he had left on the folding table. At 11:30, Celeste turned from the paintings and moved to the wooden cases. She studied the brass clasps without touching them. Then she selected the case nearest the windows, the one with the darkest leather handles, and released the clasps with the care of someone who understood that care was the only appropriate speed. The interior was padded in dark green velvet, pressed flat from decades of undisturbed contact with the objects it held. Coins sat in individual formed depressions, 40 of them, arranged in 4 rows. Each piece fitted exactly into its slot, as if the case had been built around them specifically, which it probably had. Celeste lifted one coin from its slot with 2 fingers and held it under the flashlight. She asked Clara if she knew anything about numismatic collections. Clara said she did not. Celeste said, "These are gold pieces, and several of them are pre-1893 United States issues. The variety of origins suggests this is a deliberate collection rather than a single acquisition from one source." She put the coin back and opened a second case. This one held paper, which Clara had not expected. Folded certificates, aged but intact, each one held flat by a weighted bar system fitted into the case's interior to prevent curl over time. Celeste did not touch them. She photographed them from above and noted that the printing and paper stock required independent assessment but were visually consistent with financial instruments from the early 20th century. She said, "Gold certificates." She said it matter-of-factly, the way you name something when naming it is the most useful thing you can do in the moment. The third case held bearer bonds, which Clara recognized from her research of the preceding weeks, the phrase that had appeared in the probate filing describing Arthur Harlow's converted assets. Instruments of private finance with no registered ownership, payable to whoever held them physically. Celeste counted them without touching. She looked up at Clara and said, "I need to bring in a colleague who specializes in financial instruments. This is not my primary area of expertise, and you need someone specific." Clara said, "Can that call wait until I have spoken with my attorney?" Celeste thought about that. She said, "Yes, but not by more than a day." They worked through 4 more cases before Celeste stopped. She said she needed to document everything before going further and that they should take a break. They went to the management office and Celeste transferred her photographs to a secure drive while Clara made notes in her own notebook, maintaining the chain of record she had started on the first night. They returned to the room at 2 in the afternoon and opened the remaining cases. Cases 4 through 6 held variations on what had come before. One contained additional coins, older than those in the first case, including several pieces whose markings Celeste identified as consistent with pre-Civil War United States gold coinage. Another held folded documents that appeared to be private promissory instruments. They're legal. Weight depending on the issuing parties, and Celeste noted these specifically for the financial instruments specialist she had mentioned. The 6th case held what appeared to be additional bearer bonds, more of them than the 3rd case, stacked flat in a formed tray under archival tissue. The 7th case was smaller than the others, approximately the size of a shoebox, and when Celeste released the clasps and lifted the lid, the interior held not a collection of objects, but a single sealed envelope and a small leather-bound notebook, each resting flat against a layer of padded velvet. The envelope was cream-colored, still intact after decades in the sealed room, sealed with red wax that had darkened but had not cracked. No name appeared on the exterior. The envelope bore, in careful and even handwriting, 3 words. "To whom found." Celeste looked at Clara. Clara looked at the envelope. Neither of them moved for a moment. Then Celeste said, "I am not qualified to open that or to advise on it. That is a matter for your attorney." She placed the lid back on the 7th case with the same care she had brought to everything else and moved to the 8th. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at the 7th case where it sat on the east wall. She thought about the plywood sealed over the windows, painted on the exterior to match the limestone. She thought about the archival-grade cloth covers on the canvases and the velvet padded cases built for specific objects, and the weighted bars in the certificate case designed to prevent curl over a long storage period. She thought about what a person was communicating when they prepared a room with this level of care for the possibility of a very long absence. He had known someone might eventually find this room. He had thought about that person. He had prepared something for them and addressed it to them by the only description available, whoever found it. She called Adrian from the corridor while Celeste continued working. Adrian Marsh had been a law school friend of Clara's sister-in-law before the marriage ended, and that connection became awkward. She practiced estate law and property rights, and had been the second call Clara made when she first identified the sealed wall, before she had done anything beyond mapping the architectural discrepancy. Adrian had told her then, "Document before you disclose, and involve an attorney before you open anything." Clara had followed both instructions. She described the envelope to Adrian now. Adrian said, "Do not touch it." She said she could be there in 90 minutes. Clara returned to the management office and called her neighbor to arrange for Marco's school pickup. She left a voicemail for Sophia, saying she would be late and would explain later. Sophia would understand the deliberateness of the withheld information. She would wait without adding pressure to the situation, which was one of the things about her daughter that Clara had never been able to fully articulate. Sophia operated with a self-sufficiency that was partly her natural disposition and partly the accumulated adjustment of years spent reading household difficulty accurately and deciding that adding to it was not something she wanted to do. Clara was proud of her for it. She was also aware that no 16-year-old should have had to develop that particular quality, and that the development of it represented something in their shared history that she carried differently than Sophia did. She opened her notebook and wrote down the sequence of the afternoon in order, with times, the way she had been trained to maintain incident reports during her hotel management years. Every call she had made, every person she had spoken to, every photograph she had taken, every case that had been opened in what sequence. She was building a record. She had always built records, not because someone told her to, but because she had learned early in her career that documentation was what protected you when institutions made decisions about what had happened. Adrian arrived at 12:40. She was 44, tall, with the deliberate pacing of someone who managed situations that could turn catastrophic if she moved too quickly through them. She came through the service entrance with a rolling document case and a coat that still had rain on the shoulders. She reviewed Celeste's photographs on her phone in the lobby, asked 2 questions about the condition of the 7th case specifically, and then said she needed to see the room. The 3 of them stood at the doorway of room 606. Adrian was quiet in the same way Celeste had been quiet on first seeing it. She asked Clara to walk her through the sequence of events again, from the first time she noticed the wall through this morning, in order and without skipping anything. Clara did. Adrian listened without interrupting. When Clara finished, Adrian asked 3 questions. First, had Clara received anything from the bank in writing about the scope of her responsibilities as the building monitor? Clara retrieved the single-page contract from her bag. Second, had she signed anything that transferred discovery rights or assigned any claim arising from her work at the property to the bank? Clara said she did not believe so, but had not reviewed it specifically for that language. Adrian looked at it for less than 30 seconds and said, "You have not." Third question, had she told anyone at the bank anything about the room, the wall, or anything she had found in the building? Clara said no. Adrian said, "Good." Then she put on gloves and crossed to the 7th case and opened it. She lifted the sealed envelope with both hands and examined the exterior. She studied the wax seal, then the handwriting, then the condition of the paper itself. She asked Celeste what the leather notebook in the case suggested about its period of manufacture. Celeste said the binding and leather type were consistent with production. In the mid to late 20th century, most likely between 1960 and 1990. Adrian nodded once. She opened the envelope. The paper inside was folded into thirds. For pages, cream stock that had held well in the preserved conditions of the room. The handwriting was the same careful, even hand as the exterior inscription, the writing of someone who worked deliberately rather than quickly. Adrian read, without speaking. Her face did not change. Celeste stood to one side. Clara leaned against the door frame and looked at the covered canvases and the wooden cases and the 2 safes that they had not yet opened, with their combination dials facing outward and the thin, even dust of decades on their surfaces. Adrian finished the 4 pages and started again from the beginning. When she reached the end the second time, she looked up. She said, This is a testamentary provision, specifically a codicil, which is an amendment to a larger will. It sets forth a specific bequest condition. She folded the pages back into thirds and placed them carefully on the velvet interior of the seventh case. She looked at Clara. She said, Arthur Harlow documented, in 1987, an instruction that any person who discovered the contents of this room and who had no prior knowledge of the provision's existence and who was not a blood relative of his or a party to his estate would receive 40% of the total appraised value of everything in the room. Clara looked at her. Adrian said, the document requires authentication. The estate will need to be formally re-examined, and there will need to be a probate court filing before anyone can act on it. None of that is a simple process. But the document exists, and it says what it says. Clara sat down on the stripped hotel mattress. She put her hands in her lap and looked at the floor. After a moment, she said, 40% of how much? Adrian said she would not speculate at this stage. Celeste said the same. Clara looked around the room. She had been in hotels her entire professional life. She had worked in properties that served guests paying $400 a night and properties that served guests paying $60. She had walked through ballrooms and function spaces and penthouse suites and basement storage areas. She knew what a room that held something valuable felt like against a room that held nothing, because she had been in both kinds and understood the difference the way you understand something that your whole body registers rather than just your eyes. She sat with that knowledge for a moment. Adrian asked about the small leather notebook that had accompanied the envelope in the seventh case. She opened it while Celeste photographed the interior of the case from above. The notebook held 41 pages. Most of them were inventory pages in Arthur Harlow's careful handwriting, 1 page per case, listing the contents in concise but specific language. In the margin of the first inventory page, in a hand that matched the rest, 2 combinations were noted with the labels North Safe and South Safe. Clara and Celeste looked at each other. Adrian said, this is a legal matter before it is anything else. What is in those safes requires documentation in the same sequence as everything else. But we are going to need to open them eventually, and the document gives us a path to do that without forcing entry. They opened the North Safe first. The dial spun with the smooth resistance of precision mechanics that had not degraded over the decades. The combination worked on the second try. Inside, more bearer bonds, banded in sets of 10, with a small typed card reading currencies of final resort and nothing else. Beneath the bonds, a set of folded documents in a sealed interior envelope, which Adrian set aside for separate review under the same chain of custody. The South Safe held 2 things. A small metal box with a key lock, which the leather notebook cross-referenced to a key taped to the inside back cover, and a single piece of paper folded once. Adrian unfolded the paper carefully. It held a handwritten list, 7 lines, each line a city and a number. No names, no dates. She studied it for a moment. She said, I do not know what this is. She placed it with the sealed envelope from the safe and said both required specialist review before anyone made assumptions about their relevance. The metal box held gold, not coins this time, for small rectangular bars, each one stamped with the same marks. Celeste lifted one with both gloved hands, turned it, set it down, and did not comment. They stood in room 606 for a moment in the quiet that follows understanding. Then Adrian said, the first thing you need to understand is that from the moment you disclose this discovery to the bank, a clock starts on a complicated legal process. The second thing you need to understand is that you have done everything correctly up to this point. Every step. And the third thing is that what happens next requires you to continue doing everything correctly, which is going to mean patience. Clara said she was familiar with patience. She drove home at 5:15 with the afternoon light going orange and thin over the downtown buildings. Marco was on the couch when she arrived, a library book about prehistoric marine life open on his chest and his sneakers on the wrong feet, which meant he had put them on himself in a hurry and his sister had not noticed or had decided not to correct it. Clara stood in the doorway and looked at him for a moment before he woke up. She made dinner and they ate together, the 3 of them at the kitchen table that had seen most of the significant conversations in the last 14 months. Marco talked about the sauropod comparison he had been developing as a personal intellectual project, which involved very specific statistics about femur length in relation to estimated body mass. Clara listened to all of it. Sophia ate without her phone. for once, which was itself a form of attention. After the children were in bed, Clara sat at the table with her notebook open. She turned to the column where she tracked incoming money. She looked at it for a while. Then she wrote a question mark at the bottom of the column and drew a circle around it. She closed the notebook and slept. Adrian filed the discovery notification the following morning through certified mail, initiating the formal process that would alert the relevant probate courts and the bank's legal department. The bank received it on Monday. By Tuesday morning, Clara had a call from a number she did not recognize. The man who answered identified himself as a representative from the bank's legal division. He said he needed to schedule a meeting regarding the discovery at the Calloway Grand property. His tone was the tone of institutions encountering something outside the plan, professionally even, carrying beneath it the precise and contained pressure of people who had received new information and were working out the correct response. Clara told him her attorney would be in contact and ended the call. On Tuesday afternoon, Keith Ashby appeared at the service entrance. He was not carrying his clipboard. He wore a different coat than he had worn on any of the previous occasions Clara had seen him, and his posture had changed, the body language of a person recalibrating in real time. He asked if he could come in. Clara said her attorney had advised her to conduct all communications about the discovery through legal channels. He said he understood, and then he said her name, and said that he had been the asset manager on this property for 8 months. He said it the way people say things when they are trying to establish a relationship they had not previously invested in establishing. The thermos of coffee on the first night had been the only genuine warmth in the previous 8 months of interaction, and this did not feel like that. Clara said she knew that. She said her attorney would be in contact with his office. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The bank is going to take the position that any assets discovered within the physical structure of a foreclosed property belong to the foreclosed estate." Clara said she was aware that would be the bank's position. She said, "I disagree with it." She held the door open. He left. When she told Adrian about the conversation that evening, Adrian said that was the position she had fully expected and that they were prepared for it. The legal question was not a simple one, but its core was straightforward. The private accommodation arrangement between George Calloway III and Arthur Harlow had explicitly described room 606 as Harlow's personal space for secure storage of his own property. The arrangement transferred no ownership of anything stored inside the room to the hotel. Whatever Arthur Harlow had placed in that room remained legally his, and therefore his estate's, and therefore subject to the terms of his testamentary provisions. The bank's lawyers were aware of this. Adrian said the reason the initial call had been as measured as it was, rather than immediately aggressive, was that they were assessing how thoroughly Clara understood her own position. She understood it thoroughly. The Harlow heirs appeared on the following Thursday, 11 days after the discovery notification had been filed. There were 2 of them, or 2 who presented themselves as such. The first was a man named Philip Harlow, 63, from a suburb of Hartford, Connecticut. He described himself as Arthur Harlow's nephew, his late father's brother's son, which placed him at 2 degrees of removal from Arthur himself. He had learned of the discovery through a legal notice that Adrian's probate filing had triggered in the Connecticut record system, because Arthur Harlow's original estate proceeding had been opened in Hartford in 1994 after he was declared deceased. Philip had a Hartford attorney who filed a claim on his behalf within 48 hours of receiving the notice. The second claimant was a woman named Sandra Voss, 57, from Chicago. She described herself through her attorney as Arthur Harlow's former business partner and personal representative, with a representative's interest in his estate arising from an alleged agreement between them from 1985. Her attorney was a Chicago-based estate specialist who filed a separate claim and stated that the relevant document proving the alleged agreement would be produced in discovery. Clara received a call from Adrian the evening the second claim was filed. Adrian reviewed both claims without editorializing and then told Clara what she needed to know. Philip Harlow's claim was more straightforward in its basis and weaker in its specific strength. The 1994 probate had been opened without locating any assets, had proceeded as far as it could without a resolution, and had gone dormant. Philip Harlow had not pursued closure. His claim as a blood relative to assets from an open estate had a theoretical foundation, but it would compete directly with the finder's provision in Arthur's codicil, which specifically excluded blood relatives from eligibility. Adrian noted something else. The 1994 Hartford probate record listed Philip Harlow as a notified party at the time of filing. He had received the formal notice of his uncle's presumed death, had acknowledged it, and had taken no action on the estate for 32 years. His attorney was now arguing urgency on behalf of a client who had not contacted the probate court once in 3 decades. Adrian said this was not disqualifying, but it was the kind of detail that courts noticed. Sandra Voss was harder to assess. An undocumented or orally claimed business partnership from 1985 was not standard grounds for an estate interest, but if her document said what her attorney claimed it said, it added a third layer to an already multi-party situation. Adrian said she had made a preliminary inquiry with the Chicago attorney and learned that Sandra Voss had been attempting to locate Arthur Harlow's estate through various channels since 2009, which was either evidence of a genuine long-held interest or evidence of a persistent opportunist who had finally found the opening she had been looking for. Probably both were partially true, Adrian said, and figuring out the proportions was what discovery was for. Clara said, so there are now 4 parties. Adrian confirmed, the bank, a blood relative, an alleged business partner, and Clara herself. And the document says Clara is entitled to 40%. Clara said, yes, it does. Adrian said, the enforceability of that codicil is what probate court is going to have to determine. And the process is going to take time. How much time? Clara asked. Adrian would not promise a timeline. She said the first requirement was a complete valuation of the room's contents, because all parties needed to understand what the actual number was before the legal arguments could be fully framed. The formal valuation took 11 days. Celeste Drummond brought in 2 colleagues, a specialist in Northern European paintings from a university museum's curatorial department, and a financial instruments appraiser from a firm that handled historical bonds and certificates specifically. The process required controlled access to the room, a chain of custody log, and documentation at every stage that could withstand legal scrutiny. Clara was present for the first session and the last. On the intervening days, she kept doing her rounds. She checked her 12 reader stations every 2 hours, logged her entries, ate her protein bars from the mini fridge in the management office, and worked through the building's familiar corridors. She was still being paid under her 90-day contract, which remained in force regardless of what was being assessed in room 606. And she was a methodical person who did not abandon the task in front of her because a different situation had gotten more complicated. On a Thursday morning during the 9th day of the valuation process, Prentice came in for the day shift and told Clara she looked like someone who had been told something she was not allowed to repeat. She said, "That is about right." He said, "Is it the building?" She looked at him. She asked, "What do you know about this building?" He said, "I know it is the kind of place where something has usually happened. Old hotels like this one. They keep things." He said it the way you state something you have understood for a long time without being asked. Clara looked at him for a moment. She said, "How long have you been doing this work?" He said, 14 years. She almost told him. She stopped herself because she was a methodical person and this was not the right step in the right order. But she thought about him on the drive home that afternoon, about 14 years of walking through empty buildings and what kind of understanding that accumulated in a person, about whether there had been other rooms in other buildings that someone walking methodically through the corridors every 2 hours might have noticed if they had been paying attention in a particular direction. She did not think Prentice paid attention in that direction. She thought he paid attention in the direction of getting through the shift without incident and going home. She could not decide whether that was the right approach or not. The valuation was completed on a Friday afternoon. Celeste called at 4:17. She said, "The formal assessment is complete. The 12 paintings have been provisionally valued at a range between $58 and $84 million, pending full authentication of 2 works that require additional controlled analysis. The assessment uses the midpoint of that range for current purposes, which is $71 million. The numismatic collection has been assessed at $22 million. The bearer bonds and gold certificates together total $31 million. The remaining cases, including several items of additional historical significance in the areas of early American currency and private instruments, bring the full figure to $141,320,000. Clara said, $141 million. Celeste said, approximately. That is the current working figure pending full authentication. Clara did not say anything for a moment. She was at the folding table in the management office. The space heater was running. The fluorescent light was buzzing in its slightly altered frequency. Outside the window, the city was doing what it always did in the late afternoon on a Friday, indifferent to the conversation happening inside this particular building. She said, 40% of 141 million. Celeste said, that calculation falls to your attorney. Clara said, 56 million. She said it the way you say a number you cannot yet make fully real, which is to say the way you read it off a page you have to read again to believe you read it right. The space heater ran. The light buzzed. She thought about the notebook at home on the kitchen counter, the 2 columns, the circle question mark. She thought about Diane calling this job babysitting an empty building. She thought about Keith Ashby leaving the thermos of coffee as a small act of consideration on the first night because he understood that nobody had wanted this shift and he felt, in some minimal way, that the person taking it deserved the gesture. She looked at the folding table and the mini-fridge and the single fluorescent light and thought about the 90-day contract she had signed and about what it meant that she had come to this building because the overnight differential was the difference between barely enough and not enough, and that she had walked a 6th-floor corridor 7 times before noticing what no one else had noticed. She called Adrian. Adrian confirmed the number and began reviewing what she called the current disposition of the legal situation. The bank had filed a formal motion to classify all assets discovered within the Calloway Grand as property of the foreclosed estate. Their argument had 2 components: that the private accommodation arrangement had been an informal agreement that did not survive the foreclosure transfer of the property, and that anything within the building's physical structure had therefore passed to the bank as the new title holder. Philip Harlow's attorney had filed a cross-claim asserting that as the only surviving blood relative of Arthur Harlow, Philip was entitled to all assets from the open estate, and that the codicil itself should be examined for authenticity before being given legal weight. Sandra Voss's attorney had filed a claim asserting her client's alleged business partner interest represented 15% of the total estate value, to be distributed prior to any other allocation. Clara's position was that the codicil was valid, that the bank's classification of the assets as structural property was unsound under the terms of the original accommodation arrangement, that she had met every condition specified in the finder's provision, and that 40% of the appraised value of the room's contents was therefore legally hers. Adrian said, "This is complicated." She said it without making complicated sound like a wall. She said it the way someone says a true thing because the truth is the most useful information available. Then she said, "Prepare yourself for a long process, and keep yourself completely out of the press." Clara said she could do both of those things. She went home. Marco was watching a nature documentary about deep ocean geology with the volume too loud and his homework on the table behind him untouched. Sophia was at the table, working on a calculus problem set, her phone turned face down. Clara made dinner, and they ate together. After the children were in bed, Clara sat at the kitchen table with a notebook. She looked at the question mark she had circled at the bottom of the money in column 3 weeks before. She looked at it for a while. She did not write anything next to it. She was still waiting for the right order of steps to produce the right result, and she had learned over the past 14 months that there was no shortcut in that sequence that did not eventually cost you more than you saved. The following Sunday, Sophia sat down at the family computer after breakfast and spent 4 hours doing research she had not been asked to do. Clara did not know this was happening until that evening, when she came into the kitchen and found a single printed page on the counter with a note clipped to it in Sophia's handwriting. The note said, "Found this, thought you should see it." The printed page was a record from the Vermont State Probate Archives, accessible through a digitized records database that Sophia had reached through a genealogy research platform she used for a history project. The record showed that Arthur Harlow had filed a probate document in Vermont in October of 1987. The filing date was October 14th. The document was described in the archive record as a sealed codicil to an existing will, with conditions governing discovery and distribution of personal property. Clara read it twice. Then she read Sophia's note again. Sophia had written below the document information. The seal date is October 14th, 1987. The Calloway check-in was November 3rd, 1987. He wrote the provision before he arrived at the hotel. He prepared it before he brought anything to the room. He knew something might happen, and he had already decided who should benefit if someone found what he left behind. Clara sat at the kitchen table for a while. Then she called Adrian. It was Sunday evening. Adrian answered on the second ring. She listened to what Clara described and was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "This is significant." She said, "If the Vermont Probate Archive shows the codicil was filed 6 weeks before Arthur Harlow's arrival at the Calloway Grand, it establishes 2 things. First, that the provision was not prepared after the fact in anticipation of a specific discovery, which eliminates the strongest version of Philip Harlow's argument that the document could be fabricated or unreliable. Second, and more important, it demonstrates that Arthur Harlow understood before he arrived that he might not return for what he was bringing, and that he prepared for that possibility as a standing intention rather than a last-minute arrangement." Clara said, "So he planned it." Adrian said, "He planned it. He prepared a legal framework for the finder before he put anything in the room. The codicil did not come after the fact. The codicil was the intention he arrived with." Sophia had found this in 4 hours on a Sunday afternoon using a genealogy database, because she was a 16-year-old with AP research skills and a quiet attentiveness to the situation her mother was navigating without explaining all of it. She had taken what she could observe and worked backwards from it, the way a person does when they have been raised in a household where the visible and the stated are sometimes different things, and you learn early to pay attention to both. Clara went to her daughter's room. Sophia was at her desk, reading. Clara stood in the doorway. She said, "I need to tell you something." Sophia put the book down. Clara told her everything. She started from the first night and went in order because she was a methodical person and order was how she handled things that mattered. The night the room numbers did not add up. The baseboard seam and the plaster and the brass handle underneath. The sealed air and the covered canvases. The 12 cases and the 2 safes and the envelope addressed to whoever found it. Celeste Drummond and Adrian Marsh, and the 3 other parties now filing claims in Hartford Probate Court over the contents of a room that had been sealed since the winter of 1988. Sophia listened without moving, with her full attention in the way she gave her full attention to things she understood to be important. When Clara finished, Sophia was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You found something worth $141 million. Clara said, "Yes." Sophia said, "And the document says you get 40%. Clara said, "Yes, it does." Sophia said, "So that is 56 million. Clara confirmed it. Sophia thought about that. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, quietly and without irony, "So Marco can go on his field trip." She said it to anchor the number to something real, and Clara understood that because it was the same thing she had been doing since the night she found the room, calibrating the incomprehensible against the concrete and familiar. The field trip, the application fees, the $2 extra an hour that had made the night shift at a foreclosed hotel worth taking. Clara sat on the edge of Sophia's bed. They stayed there in the quiet for a while, both of them holding the weight of it before it became the next thing that had to be managed. This was November. The legal process Adrian had described as long and complicated had barely begun. The bank's motion was pending in Hartford. Philip Harlow's cross-claim was active. Sandra Voss's attorney had requested full discovery on the accommodation arrangement between Arthur and George Calloway. The authentication of the 2 most significant paintings was still weeks from completion. Nothing had been settled. Nothing had been resolved. The morning after she told Sophia everything, Diane called. Clara let it go to voicemail. Her sister left a message that was careful in the way voicemails are careful when the person leaving them has picked something up secondhand and is not yet sure what position to take. Diane said she had heard there was some kind of development at the hotel, that a mutual contact had mentioned something without specifics, and she wanted to make sure Clara was all right. She said it the way a person says something when they have recently been reminded that the thing they called babysitting an empty building may have been something else entirely. Clara listened to the voicemail once and decided to call her back after the probate court weighed in on at least one of the motions. 2 days later, Diego texted. He said Elena had mentioned there was something happening with Clara's work situation and that he just wanted to check in. She put the phone down and thought about the 3 consecutive visits he had missed. She thought about Marco, who had stopped bringing up his father's planned appearances because he had been paying attention long enough to understand that they were possibilities rather than certainties, and that adjusting his expectations in advance was preferable to the alternative. She would respond to Diego when the time was right. That was not yet. There was a specific order to the things that needed to happen first, and she was not going to let his sudden interest in checking and disrupt it. But the Vermont filing existed. The codicil existed. Every photograph Clara had taken from the doorway before she had set a foot inside the room existed. The chain of custody documentation existed. The contract with the bank that contained no discovery rights transfer existed. The 47 days of log entries showing her methodical, unbroken presence in the building existed. Every reader station checked, every entry timestamped, every round completed because she was a thorough person even when no one was verifying it. 3 parties had filed claims in the last 10 days, each with their own legal basis and their own confidence about the strength of their position. None of them had been the one standing in that corridor on a Wednesday night in the 5th week of the assignment, paying attention to a baseboard that was 3 millimeters thicker than the surrounding trim and following the difference back to its origin instead of walking past it. That had been Clara Vega, the person who had taken the worst shift in the building everyone else had walked through without looking, paying careful attention to the thing that 7 rounds of identical routine had not erased from her field of vision. She had done every step in the right order. She intended to keep doing that. The legal battle for what Arthur Harlow had left behind was just beginning. December came to the city in stages. First, the light changed, going pale and flat by 3 in the afternoon, the downtown buildings losing their daytime authority and becoming gray shapes against a grayer sky. Then the cold settled properly, the kind that did not lift between morning and night, but simply held the city in place, and the Calloway Grand's limestone exterior took on the particular bleakness of old buildings in winter, the architecture designed for permanence becoming indistinguishable from something merely abandoned. Clara drove to the hotel through this cold every evening and left every morning as the first commuters were starting their days. She had completed 61 of her 90 contracted days. She kept doing the rounds. She kept swiping the reader stations every 2 hours. She kept writing accurate log entries, the same as she had done from the first night, because she was a methodical person and the task in front of her had not changed regardless of what was happening in a Hartford probate court. Adrian had been explicit about this during one of their weekly calls. The fact that Clara had continued to perform her duties throughout the discovery process was a meaningful part of her legal position. She had not abandoned the assignment when something more compelling appeared. She had disclosed the discovery through proper channels, maintained the chain of custody, and kept showing up to the building every night. It said something about her character as a person and about the nature of her engagement with the property. Adrian said it matter-of-factly, not as praise, but as an observation about what the record showed. Clara noted it and kept showing up. The legal process was slower than she had expected, and also exactly as slow as Adrian had warned her it would be. The Hartford probate court had consolidated the active claims into a single proceeding, which meant that the bank's motion, Philip Harlow's cross-claim, and Sandra Voss's claim were all being evaluated in the same process and on the same timeline. This was, Adrian said, actually favorable for Clara. It prevented any single party from advancing faster than the others and creating a settled situation before the codicil's finder's provision could be properly examined. Clara did not always find it easy to hold that perspective at 11:30 at night on the 4th floor of an empty building, but she tried. She had developed, over the weeks of the legal process, a different relationship with the building itself. In the first 5 weeks it had been a space she was learning, its sounds, its rhythms, its moods in different weather. After the discovery, it had become something else entirely, a place that held a secret she had found, and that was now in the middle of being resolved. Walking its corridors felt different at 2 in the morning when she knew what was behind the 6th-floor wall, when the authentication specialists had been and gone, and the court filings were accumulating in Hartford, and there was nothing for her to do in this building that was relevant to any of that. She walked it anyway. She swiped all 12 reader stations every 2 hours. She wrote the log entries. During the quiet hours between rounds, she sat at the folding table in the management office, and sometimes she read, and sometimes she just looked at the space heater and thought about her children and about what she would do differently once the legal process was behind her and the money arrived, and she had the room to think forward instead of managing toward the next month. She thought about Sophia's application fees, which had been covered out of savings she had scraped together from the differential pay over the 90-day contract. The fees were handled. She thought about Marco's field trip and the jacket pocket coins. She thought about the 14 months before this job and what they had cost her in terms that she could not enter into a notebook column. She thought about the room on the 6th floor, sealed and waiting since the winter of 1988, and about the fact that it had been here through all of it, through the hotel's decline and George Calloway's death and the bank's acquisition and 8 months of an empty building and 3 previous monitors and 7 of her own rounds. It had been here. Some nights that felt like a miracle. Most nights it just felt like the specific shape of a thing that had happened to be true. The first significant development came not from the court, but from Celeste. She called on a Thursday morning in the second week of December, and her voice had a quality Clara had not heard from her before, a contained precision that was different from her usual professional composure. She said the formal authentication of the 2 most significant paintings was complete. She said she could not discuss figures over the phone before the formal written report was transmitted to Adrian, but she asked Clara to make sure she was available on Friday afternoon to receive a call. Clara said she would be available. Celeste said, "I want to say something that is outside my professional scope to say." She paused. Then she said, "I have been doing authentication work for 23 years, and I have entered significant rooms twice. This was the second time." She said it without additional commentary. The way people communicate something large by naming it in the smallest possible terms and letting the weight of the understatement do the work. Clara thanked her and said she would be by the phone on Friday. The written report arrived at Adrian's office on Friday at noon. Adrian called at 4. She said the 2 paintings requiring extended analysis had been authenticated with high confidence. The larger of the 2, the harbor scene, had been attributed to the workshop of a significant Northern European painter of the 17th century, with the report indicating that specific passages in the work were consistent with the hand of the principal rather than workshop assistants. The second, the interior with the woman at the window, had received a full primary attribution. Adrian said, the revised valuation of the painting collection alone now falls between $91 and $108 million. The working figure for the full collection has been revised upward. Clara was standing at the kitchen counter. She looked at her hand on the counter. She looked at the slightly worn linoleum underneath her hand that had needed replacing for the better part of 3 years. She said, "What is the new total?" Adrian said, $163,400,000. Clara set her hand flat on the counter and pressed down. She said, $65,360,000. Adrian said, "At 40%, yes. That is the revised finder's figure." Clara said, "Thank you." She said she would speak with Adrian on Monday and ended the call. She stood at the counter for a few minutes. Then she started making dinner, because it was 5 o'clock and the children would be home by 6, and because having something to do with her hands was not the worst approach to the situation. The revised valuation changed the character of the legal proceedings almost immediately. When the full authentication report was submitted to the Hartford Probate Court as part of the discovery record, it drew attention from outside the proceeding. The art world was smaller than most people understood. The attribution of a 17th-century painting of that significance to a Hartford probate case involving a missing collector was the kind of information that did not stay contained within legal filings for very long. A journalist from an arts publication called Adrian's office the following week. Adrian declined comment and sent Clara a message that evening. "Stay off the record with everyone until this is resolved." Clara had not spoken to any journalist and did not intend to. She had not spoken to Diane yet either, which was its own kind of discipline given that Diane had now called 4 times and left 3 voicemails in the past 2 weeks. The Sandra Voss situation resolved itself before the court had to address it directly. Discovery had required Voss's attorney to produce the alleged business partner document. The 1985 agreement, she claimed, granted her a representative interest in Arthur Harlow's estate. When the document arrived in Discovery, Adrian reviewed it and then called Clara with the particular tone she used for information that was significant but required precise framing. She said, "The document exists. It is a letter written on letterhead from an art consultancy business that operated in Chicago in the early 1980s. It is in Arthur Harlow's handwriting, and it references a consultancy arrangement with Sandra Voss in general terms. It does not use the words estate, representative, interest, or share. It thanks her for her assistance with the transaction and mentions that he values the working relationship." Clara said. That is not what her attorney described. Adrian said. No, it is not. She said the gap between what the document actually said and what Sandra Voss's attorney had represented it as saying was substantial enough that there had been a conversation within the opposing legal team that Adrian was not party to, but had been made aware of through a collegial communication. The following week, Sandra Voss's attorney filed a withdrawal of the estate interest claim, citing a reassessment of the documentary basis. Sandra Voss herself sent no communication and made no further appearance in the proceedings. One party gone. The Philip Harlow situation was more complicated and took longer, but it also ended in the place the law pointed. Philip's attorney had argued 3 things in sequence, each one a fallback position as the previous one weakened. The first argument was that the codicil was potentially fraudulent or improperly witnessed and should be set aside entirely. The Vermont Probate Archives record of the October filing date, combined with Celeste's authentication of the room's contents as consistent with Harlow's known collection, made this argument difficult to sustain. The Hartford court declined to pursue it. The second argument was that even if the codicil was valid, the finder's provision should not apply in a situation where the assets had been discovered as part of a commercial property monitoring contract rather than a voluntary act of discovery. This argument required the court to interpret the language of the provision itself. The language was straightforward. Any person who opened room 606 without prior knowledge of the provision and who held no blood or contractual relationship to the estate. Clara's monitoring contract had not referenced the room, had not created any estate relationship, and had not involved any prior knowledge of the provision. The court declined the second argument. The third argument was that Philip Harlow, as the sole surviving blood relative of a man with no spouse or children, had a residual claim to the 60% of estate value not allocated by the finder's provision. This argument was both the weakest of the 3 in principle and the strongest in its actual legal foundation. Adrian told Clara directly. Philip's claim to a portion of the remaining estate value as blood heir was legitimate. What it was not was a claim to Clara's 40%. Sophia asked about Philip Harlow's case one evening while Clara was cooking. She had been tracking the legal developments with the careful attention she brought to things she understood to be important, asking specific questions and not asking imprecise ones. She wanted to know whether Philip would end up with anything at all. Clara said, probably some portion of the 60% that belongs to the estate. That is what the court will have to determine. Sophia thought about that. She said, so the person who did nothing for 32 years still gets something. Clara said, the law has a specific view on blood relatives and estates. It is not about who deserved what. Sophia looked at her for a moment. She said, you are extremely calm about this. Clara said, being calm is the correct approach. And then she said, also I have been waiting for something to go right for 14 months, and I am not going to ruin it by being undisciplined about the parts one cannot control. Sophia nodded once, in the way she nodded when she was filing something away as a principle worth keeping. It was Sophia who found George Calloway's letter. She had continued her research in the intervening weeks, working through digitized archive databases the way she worked through anything that interested her, methodically, in the hours between finishing her homework and going to sleep. She was looking for any documentation of the specific language of the accommodation arrangement between George Calloway III and Arthur Harlow, beyond the newspaper notice from 1987, because she had decided that the more precisely they could characterize what George had agreed to, the less room the bank had to argue that the arrangement did not survive the foreclosure transfer. She found it in the digital archive of a regional business history journal that had profiled local long-standing businesses in 2009. The profile was of the Calloway Grand itself, a feature published 6 years before George's death, in which he had been interviewed at length about the hotel's history and philosophy. Most of it was familiar territory from the material Clara had already researched. But in the third section of the interview, discussing long-term guest relationships, George had said the following. He had said that some guests came to stay for years rather than months, and that in those cases the relationship between the hotel and the guest became something the standard hospitality framework was not built to describe. He had said that when a trusted guest of long-standing asked him in 1987 to maintain a room as private storage for personal property, under a formal arrangement in which the guest retained complete legal ownership of everything stored there, he had agreed without hesitation, because that was the kind of relationship the Calloway Grand had always understood it was in the business of building. He had said, whatever George I built these walls for, he built them to keep faith with the people who trusted them. I have tried to do the same thing. He had not named Arthur Harlow. The interviewer had not asked. But the language was explicit in the one way that mattered for the legal question: complete legal ownership of everything stored there, retained by the guest. Sophia printed the article and left it on Clara's pillow with a post-it that read, Page 7, third column, paragraph 4. Clara read it at 1:15 in the morning when she got home from her shift, sitting on her bed still in her coat. She read the paragraph 4 times. She thought about George Calloway III, 72 years old in 2009, 6 years from the end of his life, still keeping the faith of an arrangement he had made with a man who disappeared in 1988. Talking about it in careful terms in a regional journal interview that almost no one would read. Not as a confession, as a statement of principle. She called Adrian in the morning. Adrian's response was the most animated Clara had heard from her in the weeks of working together. She said, "This is directly on point for the bank's structural property argument. This is the hotel's own owner, on the record, describing the legal character of the arrangement in terms that directly contradict the bank's position." She submitted the interview to the court record the following day. The bank's structural property motion came to a hearing in the third week of January, 10 weeks after Clara had filed the discovery notification. Adrian prepared her for the deposition across 6 hours over 2 days, going through every question the bank's attorneys might ask, every sequence of events from her first evening at the Calloway Grand through the morning she had called Celeste Drummond. Clara told her there was nothing in the sequence she was uncertain about. Every step was in the log. Every call was documented. Every photograph had a timestamp. She had not entered the room without Celeste present. She had not touched the contents of the 7th case before Adrian arrived. She had not disclosed the discovery to the bank before following the documentation sequence. Adrian said, "I know. I have the record. I am asking because I want you to be able to say all of it in your own words, clearly and without hesitation, because the way you say it matters as much as what you say." Clara gave the deposition in a conference room in Hartford on a Wednesday morning. She wore the blazer she had bought for her final interview at Meridian Harbor and had not worn since. She answered every question without hesitation, without elaboration beyond what was asked, and without once moving from the order in which things had actually happened. She had spent 15 years in hotel operations, where the quality of your incident documentation was the difference between a manageable situation and an unmanageable one. The bank's attorney was thorough and professional, which Clara respected. He worked chronologically through her first weeks at the Calloway Grand, through her research process, through her contacts with Celeste and Adrian, and through each step of the documentation sequence. He was looking for the moment where she had deviated from proper procedure, or where her account of events would conflict with the written record, or where she had made a decision she could not fully justify. He did not find any of those moments, because they did not exist. The bank's attorney asked her why she had not immediately notified the asset manager when she discovered evidence of the sealed room. She said, "I discovered a wall anomaly. I researched the architectural plans. I confirmed there was a discrepancy. I consulted with legal and authentication professionals as to the correct documentation sequence before disclosing to a party with a financial interest in the property. That is the correct procedure for a situation involving potential discovered assets." The attorney asked whether that sequence of steps had been motivated by a desire to establish a legal claim before the bank could act. She said, "It was motivated by the fact that doing it in the wrong order would have produced a worse outcome for everyone, including the proper management of the assets. The documentation sequence I followed is the same sequence any professional would recommend. I followed it because I know how to do my job." The bank's attorney did not ask a follow-up question on that point. On the drive home from Hartford that afternoon, Adrian said that the deposition had gone as well as it could have gone. Clara said she was not surprised. Adrian gave her a look that Clara recognized as the expression of someone reassessing a preliminary assumption. Clara said, "I'm not being arrogant. I am saying I prepared well, and the record is clean. Those are not the same thing as arrogance." Adrian said, "No, they are not." She drove the rest of the way without comment, which was its own form of agreement. The Hartford Probate Court issued its ruling on the bank's structural property motion 6 days later. The court found that the 1987 accommodation arrangement between George Calloway III and Arthur Harlow constituted a legally valid personal property storage agreement in which title to the stored assets was explicitly and unambiguously retained by Harlow. The bank's acquisition of the Calloway Grand's physical structure and real property through foreclosure had not transferred ownership of assets held in the hotel under a separate personal property arrangement. The assets in room 606 were property of Arthur Harlow's estate and were not subject to the bank's foreclosure claim. The bank's structural property motion was denied. Adrian called Clara at 9 in the morning with that news. Clara sat in the management office with the space heater running and the fluorescent light buzzing and said, "So that leaves the codicil." Adrian said, "That leaves the codicil, and the court is ready to take it up." The codicil hearing was held in February, on a day when the city had a thin layer of snow on the pavement that turned to gray slush within 2 hours of arrival. Clara drove to Hartford with Adrian. They sat in a courtroom smaller than Clara had pictured, with wooden benches and overhead lighting that made everyone look slightly unwell. Philip Harlow was across the room with his attorney. He was 63 and looked like someone who had spent the better part of several months in a state of sustained agitation. Clara looked at him once and then did not look at him again. The court had already examined the codicil, the authentication of the document's age and handwriting, the Vermont probate filing record establishing the October filing date, and the chain of custody documentation from the room. The hearing was largely procedural, an opportunity for the remaining parties to make their final arguments before the court ruled. Philip Harlow's attorney made a competent argument for the blood relative claim against the finder's provision. The provision's conditions, he argued, were unusual and arguably too specific to be enforceable under standard estate law. The court had already signaled in preliminary communications that it did not find this persuasive, but the attorney was thorough. Adrian made the argument for Clara. She was precise, unhurried, and organized in a way that Clara recognized as a professional version of her own working style. She walked through the conditions of the finder's provision one at a time. Discovery without prior knowledge, no blood relationship, no estate party relationship. She walked through Clara's documented history at the property, her professional background, and the absence of any prior connection to Arthur Harlow or his estate. She cited George Calloway's own statement in the 2009 interview as independent corroboration of the arrangement's legal character. She submitted the Vermont filing date as definitive evidence of Harlow's standing intent, established before he arrived at the hotel. Then she was done. The court recessed and came back in 40 minutes. The judge said that the codicil was a valid testamentary provision, properly witnessed and filed, with a documented date of execution that preceded the associated property storage arrangement. The conditions of the finder's provision were clearly stated and unambiguous. The court found that Clara Vega met all specified conditions. She had discovered the contents of room 606 without prior knowledge of the provision. She held no blood relationship to the estate, and she was not a party to the estate in any capacity. The provision was therefore operative. Clara Vega was entitled to 40% of the total appraised value of the room's contents. Adrian put her hand on Clara's arm briefly and then took it away. Clara looked at the table in front of her. She thought about the baseboard seam on the 6th floor, 3 millimeters thicker than the surrounding trim, catching the light of a flashlight at the right angle. She thought about what it meant that she had walked that corridor 6 times without seeing it, and that the 7th time had been different. She thought about what the 7th time through had actually felt like. Nothing special. A Wednesday night, cold, 3rd week of November, 4th hour of her shift. She had not been searching for anything. She had been walking the same corridor she always walked, doing the same round she always did, and she had simply not stopped paying attention. That was all it was. She had not stopped paying attention when it would have been entirely reasonable to do so. She thought about Keith Ashby saying good luck in the parking lot on the first night, in the tone of someone completing a formality. She thought about Diane calling it babysitting an empty building. She thought about Prentice and his system for reducing the work to the minimum required, and about what 14 years of that approach might have accumulated for him or cost him. She thought about the 3 previous monitors who had walked the 6th floor corridor and not noticed. She thought about Arthur Harlow sitting somewhere in the fall of 1987 and writing, in careful and even handwriting, a provision for a person he would never meet. Then she gathered her coat from the back of the chair and stood up. Philip Harlow's attorney filed a motion for reconsideration before they left the building. The court acknowledged receipt and denied it the following morning. Adrian called with the final certified number on a Friday afternoon in the third week of February. The formal appraisal had been completed under court supervision, with 3 independent assessors whose figures had been averaged per the court's protocol. The final assessed value of all assets in Room 606, accounting for condition, attribution, and market comparables, was $162,800,000. 40% of that number was $65,120,000. Clara was in the parking lot of Marco's school when the call came, early for pickup because she had not been able to sit still in the apartment that afternoon. She was watching the school's front entrance when her phone rang. After Adrian finished speaking, Clara sat in the car for a while with her phone in her lap and watched a group of second graders come out of the building in their winter coats, moving in that loose, uncoordinated way that small children move when they have been inside too long and the cold air is a relief. Marco was not among them. He came out a few minutes later with his backpack on one shoulder and his library book tucked under his arm, looking at something on the ground. He looked up and found her car and waved. She waved back. She called Diane that evening. Her sister answered on the second ring, faster than she had answered calls from Clara in several years. The conversation was careful at first, both of them aware of the weeks of unreturned calls and the things that had been said about the night shift job and the things that had not been said in response. Diane asked how Clara was doing. Clara said she was well. There was a pause that acknowledged something without naming it. Then Diane said, "I'm sorry I called it babysitting." Clara said, "I know you are." Diane said, "I didn't understand what you were doing over there." Clara said, "I didn't either, at first. I was just trying to do it right." Diane was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You always were like that. Even when we were kids. You could not do something halfway." Clara said, "I know. Dad used to say it was annoying." Diane said, "He was wrong." Her voice had changed into something softer and more direct, the voice she used when she was finished performing a position and was just talking. She asked when she could come over and see the kids. Clara said, "Any Sunday." She did not call Diego that week or the week after. She thought about what she wanted to say to him and decided she would say it when she could say it calmly and from a position that was not reactive. That was the right way to handle a conversation that involved her children's father and a set of circumstances that had changed in ways he had not anticipated when he had sent the casual check-in text 2 months earlier. She would say what needed to be said in the right order and at the right time. She always did. When she did call him, in the third week of March, she said what needed to be said in about 12 minutes. She told him that she understood he was interested in being more present in the children's lives and that she had no objection to that. She also told him that the 3 consecutive missed visits had registered with Marco in a way that would take time to rebuild from, and that the route back to a reliable presence required showing up when he said he would, in a consistent way, over a period of time that was long enough for Marco to stop adjusting his expectations downward in advance. She said it without anger, because anger was not the most useful register for this particular conversation, and because she had had enough time alone with her thoughts to know that what she wanted for her children was simpler and more specific than revenge for anything. Diego said he understood. He said he was sorry about the missed visits. She said, "I know you are. Let's talk about the schedule." They worked out a schedule. She would not tell him about the money until the estate settlement was complete, and her attorney advised she could, because the information was still protected, and also because some conversations were better had from a position of certainty rather than process. She finished her 90-day contract. The assignment ended on the last day of February, 2 days after Adrienne's call with the final number, and Clara drove to the Calloway Grand for the last time on a morning that was cold and clear and bright in the way that late February mornings can be bright, carrying some pressure in the air that said things were about to change even if the temperature had not caught up yet. She did her final round. She swiped all 12 reader stations. She wrote her last log entry in the same format as the first one: date, time, a brief, accurate description of conditions. She turned off the space heater and the fluorescent light in the management office. She left the mini-fridge clean and empty. She put the key ring on the folding table. Prentice was waiting at the service entrance for the handoff. He looked at her face when she came down the stairs and said, "It was the building, wasn't it?" She said, "Yes." He nodded slowly, without surprise, the way someone nods when a thing they have suspected turns out to be confirmed rather than a thing they are learning for the first time. He said, "I always thought that one had something in it." She said, "You were right." He was quiet for a moment. He looked past her into the building's service corridor, which stretched back into the dim emergency, lighting the way it always had, familiar and unchanged. He said, "You know, I have monitored 23 buildings in 14 years. Old hotels, old factories, old banks. You walk enough of those at 3 in the morning, and you start to understand that the ones that have been standing a long time are standing for a reason. They have outlasted their original purpose and their original people. There is usually something in that." Clara said, 14 years is a long time to have that understanding and not look harder for it. He looked at her. He said, "I never wanted to find anything. I just wanted to get the shift done." She thought about that for a moment. She said, "I know." He said, "Are you going to be all right?" She said yes, she was going to be all right, and she said it with the particular certainty of someone who had arrived at that statement through a sequence of events that had tested every part of it before confirming it. Prentice nodded again, the way someone nods when they recognize certainty and do not need to question it further. He took the key ring and held the service door. She walked out into the February morning. She drove past the front of the hotel on her way out of the lot, something she did not usually do. She went slowly around the block and stopped for a moment with the engine running, looking at the limestone facade and the terracotta detail and the brass marquee letters, some of which had come loose over the years and left gaps in the name. She looked at it the way you look at something you understand you are seeing in a particular moment that will not repeat. The building looked back at her the way old buildings look back at you, solid, indifferent to the occasion, prepared to still be there when you are gone. She drove home. Sophia received her acceptance to the State University's honors program on a Tuesday afternoon in March. She texted Clara a single line, "I got in." Clara read it at a red light and sat through the green while the car behind her waited and eventually honked. She did not care. She texted back, "I knew you would," and drove on. That evening at the kitchen table, Clara told them the full picture. She told Marco first, because he was 9 and he asked direct questions, and he deserved to hear things in terms he could actually hold. She told him that the hotel she had worked at had a special room in it, and that the room had things inside it that belonged to someone who was gone, and that because she was the one who found the room, some of the value of those things was going to come to their family. Marco asked how much. She told him. He thought about it for a moment with the expression he used when he was working a problem that required more information before it could be properly categorized. He asked if that was a lot. She said yes, it was a lot. He thought for another moment, and then asked if that meant they could stay in this apartment. She said yes. He thought about it again. Then he asked if they could get a dog. Clara said they could probably get a dog. He said, "A big one." She said, "Yes, a big one." He thought about this for a moment with visible satisfaction, and then returned to his dinner with the particular contentment of a person who has received all the information they need and finds it adequate. Clara watched him and thought about what it meant that 9-year-olds calibrated adequacy so cleanly. Enough was enough, and more than enough was an interesting fact rather than an urgent matter. She was going to have to relearn that. Then she told Sophia properly, all the numbers, the final ruling, the breakdown of the distribution, the estate's settlement timeline, and what it meant for the coming months. Sophia listened with the same complete attention she had brought to it since the beginning. When Clara finished, Sophia was quiet. She said, "So the application fees?" Clara said, "Yes." "And the tuition? And the housing?" Sophia said, "You don't have to." Clara said, "I know I don't have to. That is not the relevant question." Sophia looked at her across the kitchen table for a long moment. She said, "Thank you." She said it simply, without elaboration, in the way people say something large when they have learned that the size of a thing does not require you to fill all the space around it with more words. The estate settlement took several more months to fully resolve. Philip Harlow received a portion of the remaining 60% after the probate court made its determination about Arthur Harlow's estate among the legitimate claims. The bank received nothing beyond what was already theirs. Sandra Voss had been removed from the proceedings entirely. The two most significant paintings were placed in the care of a regional art museum under a loan agreement pending the full estate settlement. where they were seen by several thousand people who did not know that a night security monitor doing her rounds had found them behind a plaster-faced door in a foreclosed hotel. A museum curator who saw the harbor scene on a Thursday morning in April later described it in a journal as one of the more significant attributions to come to light in the region in recent memory. He did not know, when he wrote that, the specific dimensions of the room where it had spent 37 years, or the name of the person who had opened the door. Clara knew, because knowing things accurately was how she had always operated. The Calloway Grand itself was listed for sale by the bank in the spring, and a preservation development group filed a letter of interest in April indicating they wanted to convert it into a mixed-use building with a boutique hotel on the upper floors and retail space at street level. Clara read about it in the local business section and sat with the article for a while. The limestone exterior would be restored. The marble lobby floor would be preserved. The coffered ceiling in pale gold plaster was noted specifically in the development group's letter as a feature of architectural significance worth maintaining. She thought about George Calloway I, who built it in 1931 because he believed that permanence was worth building for. She thought about what he would make of the fact that the building was still here, that it had outlasted the family that built it and the economic cycles that had pressured it and the years of emptiness, and that someone was now going to bring it back. She found that she wanted that for the building. She did not decide anything quickly, but she began to think, carefully and without urgency, about what her connection to that property might look like in a few years when the legal process was fully behind her and she had a clearer picture of what she wanted to build next. She did not immediately know what she wanted to do next, and she was comfortable with that uncertainty in a way she had not been before, because uncertainty, with $65 million available to address, it had a different character than uncertainty, with $412 in savings. She thought about the hotel industry, about whether there was a version of that work she still wanted, about whether the years she had spent in operations and management could be directed somewhere that did not depend on whether a parent company was making good financial decisions in a distant office. She thought about the Calloway Grand. She thought about what the building could be if someone with the right resources and the right commitment to its original philosophy decided to bring it back. She thought about the limestone exterior and the marble lobby floor and the coffered ceiling in pale gold plaster, and about George Calloway III living in his second-floor suite in the last years of his life, keeping faith with an arrangement he had made with a man who had not come back. She did not decide anything quickly. That was not her way. What she did first was buy the two-bedroom apartment they were in, the one with the thin walls and the difficult parking situation, because it was the place her children knew, and because the question of where to live next deserved more consideration than the question of who owned the current walls. She paid Sophia's first year of tuition and the fees and the housing deposit and everything that needed to be covered before fall. She opened an account for Marco's education and put a number in it that was large enough to take that particular line item permanently off the list of things she had to manage. She got the dog. He was large, as promised. A 4-year-old rescue with an uncertain history and a reliable disposition and a tendency to sit on feet, which Marco considered an excellent quality in a dog and which Clara found, after the first week, that she agreed with. Marco named him after the largest sauropod in the documented scientific record. The name was long and did not abbreviate well, but Marco would not hear of shortening it, and Clara decided she was not going to argue the point. She had $65 million on the way, and her daughter was going to university in the fall, and her son wanted to name his dog correctly. These were the problems she had now, and she was grateful for every one of them. The dog sat on her feet on the first evening they had him home, while she was at the kitchen table. She looked down at him, and then looked at the 2 columns in the notebook that she no longer needed to keep the way she had been keeping them, and something released in her chest that had been tightly in place for a very long time. She did not tell many people beyond those who already knew. She told Adrian, who had been there. She told Celeste, in a brief call that was warmer than their professional interactions had been. 2 people who had been in a sealed room together and understood what that meant. She sent Prentice a text after the final ruling that said only, "You were right about the building." He texted back, "I usually am," which was not accurate, but was exactly the response she had expected. She thought about Arthur Harlow sometimes in the months that followed. Not often, and not with any sense of debt or obligation, but with the particular attention you give to someone whose decision changed the direction of your life without knowing it. She thought about a man in a dark suit in a photograph from 1983, looking at something off camera, already thinking about what came next. She thought about a person who had prepared a room with archival covers and velvet padded cases and plywood sealed against the exterior light, who had filed a legal provision with a Vermont court 6 weeks before arriving at the hotel with everything he owned, who had written on a cream envelope in careful and even handwriting 3 words addressed to no one and to whoever arrived. To whom found. She had found it. She had found it because she was thorough and patient, and because she had learned over 15 years of professional life that the things worth noticing were most often the things easiest to walk past, the small discrepancies in familiar patterns, the 3mm differences in trim that meant something was underneath. Arthur Harlow had prepared this for the person who paid attention. Clara Vega had paid attention. That was the whole story, except that it was not the kind of story that ended, only the kind that turns a corner. She sometimes thought about what had happened to Arthur Harlow himself. The probate record said, missing since early 1988, presumed deceased, no verified account of his final weeks. He had arrived at the Calloway Grand in November of 1987 with everything he owned and had stayed through the winter and had disappeared before spring. The hotel's records showed no checkout, no forwarding address, no final communication. George Calloway had sealed the room in January and said nothing publicly, except to an interviewer 22 years later, in careful language that described the arrangement without naming the man. Nobody knew where Arthur Harlow had gone. Nobody had ever established what had become of him. The probate court that had declared him deceased in 1994 had done so because no one could demonstrate otherwise, and the standard waiting period had passed. Clara had looked for more information in the months after the ruling and had not found it. She had stopped looking, eventually, not because she had lost interest, but because she had recognized that some questions did not have available answers, and that living with the question was better than pretending it had been resolved. What she did know was what he had left and how he had left it. The care of the preparation, the archival materials, the fitted cases, the plywood painted to match the exterior. The codicil filed 6 weeks before he arrived, anticipating the finding. A man who had understood, before he brought his collection to a 6th-floor corner room in a limestone hotel downtown, that there was a meaningful probability he would not be the one to see it open again. Who had prepared for that probability with the same deliberate attention he had apparently brought to everything else in his professional life. She found that she respected that, not the disappearing, which she could not evaluate because she did not know its circumstances. The preparation, the decision to leave something behind that could be found, along with the instructions for what to do with it if it was. She was 35 now. Her daughter was going to university in the fall. Her son knew the name of every sauropod documented in the scientific literature and had strong opinions about which of them would have been most interesting to meet. The building they lived in was theirs. The kitchen table was the same table. She sat at it one evening in early April with her notebook open, and for the first time in longer than she could precisely remember, the 2 columns were not the first thing she looked at. She sat with the open notebook and thought about what she wanted to write in it now that the entries no longer needed to begin with what was owed and what was available to pay it. She picked up the pencil and wrote Sophia's name and Marco's name, and next to each one a number that was not an amount they needed, but an amount that was simply there, handled, because their mother had done her job properly in an empty building on the overnight shift and had paid attention to a wall that everyone else had stopped looking at. She looked at the numbers for a while. She thought about the question mark she had circled in this same notebook on the night she had come home from room 606 with the first photographs still on her phone, not yet knowing what the room held, only knowing that the shape of her situation had changed in ways she could not yet measure. She had circled the question mark instead of writing a figure because she had known, even then, that precision was the only approach worth taking. This was the precision, finally. These were the figures. They were going to hold. Outside, the April evening was doing what early April evenings do, still cool, but with something underneath the cool that was not there in February, some pressure in the air that said things were going to change. She had been in the middle of a change for the better part of 5 months, and she understood from experience that most changes felt less dramatic from the inside than they looked from the outside, that the actual experience of your life shifting was mostly quiet and incremental and felt, in the moment, like one thing following another in a sequence you were managing rather than a transformation you could stand back and observe. She sat with that for a while. Then she got up and started making dinner, because it was almost 6 and her children would be home soon, and that was the next thing. Stories like this remind us that starting over is terrifying, but it is always possible. If you or someone you love is facing a total reset right now, whether from a divorce, a loss, or a financial disaster, you need a plan. Scan the QR code on your screen or click the link below to get the Phoenix Blueprint for just $17. It gives you the exact steps you need to take in the first 48 hours and a 90-day plan to get your independence back. Thank you for watching.